All right, good morning and welcome to Web3 Wednesdays, where we chat through some of the complex and nuanced topics in crypto and Web3 at large so that you can stay ahead of the curve. So today I'm joined by Sebastian Park, co-founder of Infinite Canvas, a user-generated content meta publisher that's had a huge impact on titles like Roblox, and he's also a venture partner over at BITKRAFT, which is a gaming-focused venture fund. So Infinite Canvas has totaled a colossal number of players over the years, and they're poised to be a very powerful force heading into the Web3 creator era. Sebastian's experience across the space in scaling user-generated content and deploying across multiple ecosystems makes him a brilliant resource for gauging how this next cycle of creator-focused Web3 gaming will pan out. So we're keen to get his take on the matter. Sebastian, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right. Well, hey, jumping into it. So Infinite Canvas, you guys are a beast in the space, right? But you're very low key about it. So can you explain to the viewers here, what exactly do you guys do and how much of an impact have your contributions made in the traditional world of Web2?
Yeah, so in the Web2 user-generated gaming ecosystem, these are platforms like Minecraft, Roblox, Fortnite Creative, places where people make their own maps and make their own user games and generate revenue that way. We've been really fortunate to be a publisher in that space for 18, 24 months at this point. It's been a ton of fun. We've spent a lot of time improving game loops, improving monetization, working with dozens of different games, aggregating tens of millions of users, monthly actives and whatnot, and mostly doing it in a white label manner. We wanted to make sure, especially in the Web2 side, there were a lot of people who wanted to bang the drum of who they were. We cared more about being a white label solution, make sure the focus is on the creator themselves. And so that's certainly what we've done back then, and still to this day. Platforms like Roblox, platforms like Fortnite Creative and Minecraft boast insane number of users. They take
Talk to me about those. What kind of user numbers do you actually see over there? I'm so curious.
Oh my goodness! Across those games, you're probably seeing over 100 million users in the United States alone, right? Like it's like a different scope and scale. And certainly,
when you consider that the total gaming environment is like 3 billion people across the world, right? So that is a serious scope of players, all concentrated in those ecosystems.
Yeah, and I think if you take the under 18 or under 24 cohort, it's something like 1 out of every 2 or
wow,
like
that's
1
awesome.
out of every 1.8 people have played Roblox or are playing Roblox. One of the things that we often forget, and certainly I talk about this a lot with regards to the Web3 ecosystem, is you forget just how ubiquitous gaming is, especially in these other cohorts, right? The user numbers that you're used to are framed and benchmarked against other Web3 games and ecosystems is a very small number relative to the number of people who are playing World of Warcraft or League of Legends or any of these platforms that have user-generated gaming on them.
It's crazy. And, from my perspective, it's just going to keep picking up, right? I mean, when I grew up, it was almost like a shameful thing to say that you went home and play video games all day, right? Now it's the norm, right? And instead of golfing, sometimes I'll play video games with someone instead for a business meeting. So it's on the up and up. And I guess, hopping back to Roblox to focus on it for a second, just because it is such a big giant, right? So even beyond Roblox, a lot of these other creator-focused platforms, they have these huge take rates. So I don't even want this to be specific to Roblox, but just, kind of on the Web2, space in general, how are these platforms justifying the take rates that they use versus the people who are actually making the content?
Yeah, it's interesting. Part of it is that there's no justification to be had initially, in part because there is no alternative, right? One fun fact about Roblox's monetization, but also Fortnite Creative's monetization, is that they're often single individual team member contributions to the ecosystem. They're like, hey, let's let people make a quick buck off of this, right? Like let's add creator codes inside of Fortnite such that influencers or map makers can make a little bit of money on the side. And I don't know necessarily if everyone expected the sheer amount of volume of capital to come through. Historically, in environments, let's go back 20 years ago, if you're making a Warcraft 3 map or a StarCraft Brood War custom map, you weren't really expecting to make any money, right? Like the best case scenario was you make Counter-Strike and your team's acquired by Blizzard, by Valve, right? Or you make Team Fortress 2 and same thing happens. You weren't seeing independent people going out and making a large amount of contributions. And so these platforms right now, if you go all in, take about 75% off the top, I think is around median. Certainly much higher than what Apple and Google does in terms of their 30%, which, there's obviously a lot of litigation and debate about if that's a fair number. What you end up seeing is a combination of things. One, certainly there are scaling and network costs that they're covering. And so I think that's a completely reasonable thing. They cover all the server costs, they cover all the live ops costs, user acquisition costs. There's a lot of it happening there. But certainly, I also think that those are both numbers that we're seeing a lot of pressure as we see more and more user-generated ecosystems emerge. There's going to be a downward pressure on that take rate, and we're starting to see that already in the ecosystem.
Yeah, and I imagine it's just going to increase in pressure, right? Because, as you mentioned, it was probably one or two people who, as a side project, added creator codes to these things, right? Like, I don't know if it's actually what they set out to do. And I'm also glad that you mentioned it in the context of the old Warcraft 3 custom maps and stuff like that, right? Because when I think user-generated content, I think the Warcraft 3 custom map editor, people making those, and me spending hours playing these completely random games that were never the point. Like, that was never the point of Warcraft 3 at all, but that blew up. That became, like, what you logged on to do. So then when I look out to the Web2 gaming ecosystem, right, do you expect more Web2 games? Maybe some that don't make a lot of sense to people right now, but maybe you can see something into it, who will turn on something that looks like a Fortnite creator code system, or who will allow people to opt in to start creating. Are there some giants that are moving in that, direction, even in Web2?
For sure. I mean, certainly this is a common conversation among a lot of major games. If you see GTA Online is effectively a creator ecosystem at this point. The vast majority of Minecraft is creator based. There are, I would say, probably something like the majority. This must be a strong claim. So let's say 50.1%, right? The majority of people don't realize there's an end game to Minecraft. Right, that there is a way to beat that game.
They're just playing Bed Wars all day long. That's it.
Exactly. It's not part of the zeitgeist. And what's interesting is that we have a strong acknowledgement, especially in 2022, that the top games of our current generation have been derived from modifications of user-generated ecosystems, right? Fortnite was a mod based on the success of H1Z1, which is based on the success of the PUBG mod on top of Arma. Right, like you see League of Legends, which was based on the Dota mod in Warcraft 3. And even more recently, I think the biggest successful new game genre in the last 3-4 years has been the auto battler genre, like Teamfight Tactics, so the auto chess and the like. And that was a mod of Dota 2, if you want to go super meta, right? Like Dota 2 opens up their ecosystem, suddenly you have a new game genre emerge. It is one of the coolest things that we see over and over again about people when given the tools to create new things, and also the users, like having enough people make those things, you start to see results. You often need both. And Sam, you and I have talked about this before, but that's, I think, the hardest thing for people is a little bit of a chicken or the egg, where you need an environment with hundreds of thousands, if not millions of players in order to sustain the user-generated ecosystem. Because as you know, for doing anything creative, 99% of stuff you make is just utter crap. Like, it's just a fact of life that no matter what you write, paint, make games, maybe 99.9% of stuff is just crap. And so you need enough people to be taking shots on goal to find some really interesting games. And certainly it's really cool to see.
Sebastian, I love framing it like that too, because at the end it becomes an incentive problem, right? It becomes a as a creator or as a player, am I actually engaging enough with the ecosystem that I bet that I'm gonna, get whatever I'm looking for to get out of it, which is a great tie-in to Web3, right? Because Web3, arguably the best use case of Web3 is not to change too much of Web2. We don't want to go too crazy. We just want to put, the correct ownership and incentive structures on top of the Web2 constructs that already worked super, super well. So when you, start looking around at the really nascent Web3 UGC ecosystem, like some of these really early user-generated content experiments, what do you find most exciting? And also, what do you find most disappointing? What do you think that there should be more of?
Yeah, so I think one of the hardest parts around the user-generated ecosystem right now is that they basically fall into three main buckets. They fall into decentralization plays, they fall into composability plays, and they fall into interoperability plays. And all of them often come from a good philosophical lean where they're like trying to be all three. They're trying to be decentralized, composable, interoperable. That's awesome. It'd be awesome for a world to do so, but there really hasn't been a strong enough incentive, both in terms of audience incentives, so you're what I call soft power incentives. A lot of creators, as you and I know, want their work to be seen. As a game developer, I want my game to be played. And so if I have a choice between showing it off to a community of 10 people versus 10 million people, even if the financials are different, the 10 million people make sense because that's a part of an incentive, the soft incentive I have, versus the hard incentive of, hey, should I use this? They're taking a cut for me to use this object. Is that worth the cost? Well, it's not giving me additional upside in terms of community or revenue. Well, in that case, the cut may not be worthwhile to do. If that, I think, is making some interesting cohorting problems, right? I actually really like Blue Project initially. And I still think it's an interesting implementation. It came out last year. For those of you who don't know, it was supposed to be this like completely composable implementation where you can use it however you want. I think that's really cool. As a creator and a game developer, although quite not as good as a lot of people on my team, that type of design constraint is something that's really awesome to do. And certainly when we work on games inside Fortnite and Roblox, we are constrained by their own tools in order to make games come out. The flip side, though, is that there wasn't really a huge incentive for us to use loot. It was interesting if you owned it. It was interesting if you made it against it, but it wasn't drawing our attention the same way. And so in that worldview, we're like, hey, we could also just make a better RPG, right? And so it's a tricky conundrum, because certainly if you had like a centralized system, stuff a little bit like what Fractal and Axie are doing at this point, they can generate incentives to use their composable interoperable tools. And if you had a decentralized tool that already was being utilized elsewhere, like you see with some of the theoreticals in science fiction, then I can see the audience being large enough that you can then generate against it. So hilariously, the coolest implementations I've seen have actually been about specific CryptoPunks or specific Bored Apes, where it's like, hey, someone was so self-motivated and incentivized that they built some interesting stuff against a singular item in order to appreciate that's own value.
I love that you took it in that direction too, because this idea of Web3 interoperability comes up a ton, right? Particularly in game design, and the community ends up being super split on it. Some people say like this is impossible, some people say this is the future, and I think you really nailed it. And it's you can set up these interoperable environments like Loot, but sometimes at the end of the day, the question becomes, well, why would I use that? I can make my own. And if there's no incentive aligning the two parties, oftentimes people probably just won't use those interoperable components in the first place. So I guess it's kind of, a larger comment around interoperability. Where do you see that going as, kind of a sector of the gaming space?
Amusingly enough, I think a lot to this short story I read years ago, where it talked about if aliens invaded and they just destroyed America, for example, and they went to all the nations of the world and said, hey, it's not that we hate humans, we just hate Americans. Right, like screw those guys. And just for full context, Sam and I live in New York and we're both Americans. But like screw those guys. Like, as long as you don't interrupt with our war against America, we won't mess with you. And then the science fiction book explored the idea of, as a short story, explored the idea of, hey, like, just how much is there a tie-in of being human, right? Like, how much is that strong enough for France or China or India to be like, hey, we should go protect America, right? Like, and it went back and forth. I feel this way very passionately about companies. There has to be a strong incentive for people to work together. That incentive is usually a merger, right? Or some type of like collective. And so when I think a lot about interoperability, I think about decentralization versus centralization. I can completely see a centralized interoperable ecosystem existing. I think there have been a lot of people who are approaching that project from that way. It's harder to see a decentralized system without incentivized bits on both sides fueling both things. It's just hard to see. And so, because I can't imagine a world where Activision Blizzard and EA want to work with each other after decades of fighting, right? It's just a hard thing to do. Or Walmart and Amazon. Or, at this point, maybe even Immutable and Polygon. Like, those guys are so snippy with each other all the time.
No, you end up with these silos, right? And, even with the mantra of, everything will be interoperable, it really only goes so far, unfortunately. That's not to say that it won't work in the future. Someone may crack it. Someone may come up with a model that really nails it and everyone conforms to a common standard, which would make me very excited. But I think to date, we haven't seen anything that's really, really promising in that, kind of interoperable sector. I guess kind of, moving on to another topic around actually building these things, right? So like actually building user-generated content experiences. You guys have done a ton of work in Web 2. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. So what are a lot of the things, that worked well, either specifically in Web 2 that you think will have like a weird or different impact in Web 3? Like it's going to be slightly different for some reason, or just what do you think is important in the first place? And like what, key lessons do we need to take about UGC from Web 2 into the Web 3 world?
One of the biggest ones that I talk about often, especially in my seat at BITKRAFT, is everyone thinks that gaming is a bit like a research project where they can go into a hole and they'll emerge and create an awesome game and everyone will love it. And by the way, we are somewhat at fault for this because there are teams that have legitimately gone into a hole, worked on a game for 7 years, emerged and made a really cool game. The game that most recently comes to mind would be like Legion TD2. That team literally left, worked in a hole for 7 years and emerged with a really fun, competitive, interesting game. But that's not how modern game design works. If you think your game loops are supposed to take 3 years, just think back to what the world looked like 3 years ago. 3 years ago would be July 2019. In July 2019, we didn't have COVID. We had a thriving economy. People didn't know what Zoom was. They had just, I think, IPO'd the previous year or earlier the year, and people were like,
"What a world!" Yeah,
like, what a world, right? and so you're telling. And by the way, if you take 3 years prior to that, the biggest game in 2016 was the advent of Overwatch and how Overwatch was going to be the preeminent shooter for the next 10 years, right? And the following year, Fortnite took off in 2017 and it really blew up the world, right? So the idea that anyone can like sit in a hole, especially if they haven't done game development before, and create an interesting game is often a founder myth as opposed to an actual implementation. And I think one of the beauties of user-generated gaming is that what we see time and time and again, it's just the amount of sheer volume of good work you do. If you put in the time to make games quickly, and I'm talking about orders of magnitudes of weeks as opposed to months or and definitely not years, right? If you launch the game, you got feedback from your audience quickly, and then you go from there. One of the biggest issues that we're going to probably see in the next 6, 12, 18, 24 months in the gaming ecosystem are all these games that have been in a hole, assuming a world that in crypto doesn't exist anymore, right? Like they assume a world from January of 2022 when they raised, and that world has completely changed. And so is their game ready to live up to the test and hype? Will they be able to get over their own fears of, and this is a very common fear among creators, of being so precious with your own work that you don't want to show it to people? These are all things that kill games, projects, and startups. And I think that's like the be all end all, be it Web 2 or Web 3 user generated, which is launch quickly, iterate quickly, and be happy about failing.
Yeah, I think that Web3, some projects have done a really good job of like building totally in the open and with their community and iterating super fast. And yeah, I mean, you're right. Like a lot of other projects, and I won't name one very obvious one in the room, but one of the biggest projects in the world does not do a very good job of like building in the open. And so sometimes the community is upset and it just ends up being a miss. And I think that obviously as you move into a more UGC friendly situation where you're pushing out content all the time, like you're trying to push out new things, just as in Web 2, you gotta build quickly and you gotta build in the open. You gotta let people know what you're thinking and get that constant feedback. So I think that's great advice. What components, I guess, of Infinite Canvas right now, do you have any major pieces, any like major games that you are just so psyched to move into Web3? You just can't wait to tell people about these.
It's actually part of our overall strategy, which we don't. Like, I think it's funny because we just don't know, honestly. We know what works on Roblox. We know what works on Fortnite. But every audience is new. Every audience is different. And so part of it is the humility to say, hey, it doesn't matter how many years we've made games for how many communities we've made games for. Like, treat every community like a new one. And I think that's just so important for us to do, and so important for us to stay humble in that regard.
That's a humbling take on it. I like that. So you basically start over from scratch every time. You look at a new ecosystem, you step in, and you say, what do we do different here?
Yeah, and the big thing that we do for sure, and we always recommend to any of our people we work with, is just be iterative and be fast, right?
Yeah.
ship out quickly. We focus mostly on mid-core and casual core gaming, like because it's a faster iterative cycle out here. But that's great. One of my favorite games actually the last 12 months was probably Wolf Game, in part because of just how quickly they iterate through their cycles. So did they make mistakes? Of course. Were they a mass success? Everyone involved? Definitely not. But it's worth working through, especially when you think about just how freaking difficult it is to design tokenomics, how difficult it's to design ecosystems. There's a tokenomics designer named Tofokins, his Daniel Lee. And the thing that I always find incredibly amusing in talking to him, because his background is he used to be a Smash Melee coach, and he's doing a lot of this design. But before all that, he was a JPL rocket scientist, right? Like he was literally a literal rocket scientist, and it's still annoyingly difficult and cumbersome for him to design, right?
Well, that makes everybody feel better now, I'm sure.
Right. And so when you see the sheer amount of annoyance it is to design these macro systems, you realize that, yeah, you probably should do it out in the open, right? Like League of Legends is not balanced from day one. Now, I think that's something that's really funny to mention, right? There was a post recently, I think on Reddit, about how their new champion Zeri has had 12 changes in the last 12 updates.
Wow,
right?
really?
So
I didn't even realize that. That's crazy.
Yeah, they launched it like 24 weeks ago, and they've changed it every other week because they're like, we're still not sure if it's properly balanced.
I mean, look, that's a good way to get community feedback. I'm sure that people have mixed feelings on it, but I think it's a plus. I personally think it's great. Yeah. And I guess even, chatting around communities here for a second. So there's this idea of guilds, right, in Web3. Mm-hmm. And something that started to crop up is the idea of creator guilds. And that's obviously like a banding of people together who share some of these more expensive assets that you need to deploy into some of these ecosystems. And then they try to build things with those assets. Infinite Canvas, in some capacities, almost sounds like a very professional creator guild. So I'm kind of curious to hear your take on that, right? Do you think that's going to be a viable organizational structure for some of these like decentralized distributed communities? Do you think that this idea of expensive assets that you need to build with, like certain things are like gated within the UGC context of an ecosystem? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, so I actually am macro bullish on guilds, right? I'm certainly, full disclosure, BITKRAFT an investor, was one of the seed and pre-seed investors of YGG, and we were an investor in Baze, and certainly active in that space. But the concern we have with creator guilds, because I'm actually pretty bullish on the concept, are threefold. One, as you know, Sam, the actual cost of a guild or a DAO is incredibly expensive. And so like who's bearing this like hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal costs plus like about like 100 to 200K of annual board member costs that you have to sustain? Like, is that worth you doing? Is it worth doing it that way versus another way? And then the second one is actually a scope of scale and size. One thing I found, which I'm curious to hear if people have had different experiences, is that I actually have never found a startup is worth keeping around 25 headcount. And what I mean by that is that at 25, you're basically large enough that even if you have 3 or 4 founders, you're too large to have a flat hierarchy. You're reaching the point where you need to have mid-level managers, you need to have outsized departments, you need to start growing. And effectively the like economies of scale of having people that like it's the economies of scale are such that like the fixed cost of having a 25-person company with mid-level managers is about the same as the fixed cost of 75 people, right? Because it's just the way the structuring tends to work out. And so the value, of course, of creator guilds in my mind is like when there's a small enough group of people who are all aligned and all incentivized to work together. I've been fortunate enough to be a part of some of those things throughout my career, and they're awesome. They're some of the best times I've ever had. You get to work with really smart people, and it usually starts to break down cohorts start to break down around 8, and then startups, like flat hierarchy startups, start to break down around like 15, 20, right? And so I'm really curious to see them because I think it makes a lot of sense to pull costs. It makes a lot of sense to work together, and it makes a lot of sense that this should be aligned to the philosophies of the world. But our behavioral economic understanding of like tragedy of the commons, like, free rider problems, management issues, and additional scaling costs is pretty well understood. And so I'm curious like where those tensions intersect to make it work for creator guilds. Because in theory and in practice, they look so cool up until they stop looking cool.
Yeah, and I think that's a fair take. It's one of these new topics where we haven't seen one like really fleshed out. Like we haven't seen it like actually work yet. And arguably, even play to earn guilds are still relatively early in their cycle. And obviously, I'm bullish on it too. We operate an entire guild that builds tech infrastructure for folks like YGG, and it's it's a space that's just so new that it's tough to predict exactly where it's going to go. But I think that what we all can say is that from a macro perspective, the interest in the space is undeniable, and the people coming into it, I mean, there's just a constant flood of new entrants.
100%. We can't. Yeah. That is one of the things that I have been tracking the most over this bear cycle, is how smart are the people still coming in. Well, like one of the coolest things you can always do about industry, and this is also should make you bearish about certain industries, is just like tracking inbound talent.
Yep, watch the brain drain. Yep.
If the smartest people are entering the space, that's a good sign. And if the smartest people are the ones who've been in the space for 5-10 years, that's not a good sign, right? And so it is always cool. Like the reason why I think sports is so interesting is like the smartest people in sports are clearly the ones who have entered the sports ecosystem the last 10-20 years, not the people who've been there for 40.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And that
and
means
so
that there's,
you have this upward trajectory where
right.
you know that the space is, you're going to keep getting better over time here.
If you find an industry, or if you find a space where like the smartest person was the one who entered 6 years ago or 10 years ago, but not in the last 2-3 years, you should probably double check and double click on whether or not that space we're spending time in.
That's a great take. I love that one. That's, I think that in Web3, we all move so fast that fortunately we've all been, really lucky to have all these awesome people around us. And I do wonder what happens as the industry matures. And I guess, kind of switching gears very briefly here, you mentioned something a couple of minutes ago that was really astute, right? So like when you spin up these DAOs, there's all these costs, legal fees, construction fees, et cetera. Regulatory pressure in the space in total has been a mess, right? Like it has just been impossible to deal with. From a UGC standpoint, like from user-generated content standpoint, do you see regulation playing, a difficult role in the space? Are you concerned about anything from specifically that standpoint?
Yeah, I'm certainly concerned about a couple of bits out in the wild still. Obviously, the stuff that was happening with Epic and Apple, I think, has a macro effect on how people are going to structure the splits and going into the future. Also, the fact that, at least in the States, fair use is you can only discover fair use in this court of law, right? Like there's no way to ascertain whether or not something's fair use until you literally go to court. Which is
I didn't know that, really.
Yeah, it's a very upsetting fact about fair use, but it's because it's a doctrine and there's a lot of interesting ancillary reasons for it. And so that's concerning to me. What I would say is that we're fortunate as a space in that at the very least in 2022, everyone's aligned that user-generated is important. And user-generated actually increases your revenues, and increases the longevity of your game, and increases the uptick of the game. We saw this in video, where if you remember 10 years ago, there's a lot of creative common use of video footage to do analysis on YouTube, and they're all taken down because they're like, look, we don't want any of this. And then slowly people are like, actually, this is a decent user acquisition funnel for building up hype or interest in my content or game or genre, and so they go there, right? There was a worldview 20 years ago where, Gangnam Style by Psy would have been taken down. And instead, they put it up on YouTube 10 years ago. Did you know that Gangnam Style is 10 years old, by the way?
I did see that the other day. Is it still the most viewed video on YouTube?
I don't know if it's still the most, but it has 1 billion views, which is crazy.
Oh my God, that's nuts. That's nuts. 10 years old.
Right. That's that's what 4 billion minutes consumed over the last 10 years. It's fun math to be done. So far, people have been very positive in that direction. Hey, user-generated is awesome. The concern, of course, is that tide shifts. One of my favorite conversations I ever had was with a guy named Daryl Morey, who's now the general manager, president of basketball for the 76ers, and is credited for creating a lot of Morey ball, lots of three-point shots, open lanes, a lot of transition basketball. And the honest answer is that he didn't intend to make basketball more fun to watch. It was just a byproduct of the best way to play the game from a winning percentage. And I think in a similar vein, we don't intend necessarily as user-generated generators to make more money for the initial platforms. It's just a byproduct of what we did. If in fact this was actually negative and pulled away from value from the platforms, I'd imagine at that point you start seeing a lot more regulation and having a larger regulatory effect on these bits. That I think is something that we should be like cognizant of as we continue to push forward. Is just double click and double check, hey, are we still aligning incentives between the platforms and us? And if so, we don't have to worry about it. The moment that's not the case, you have to very much worry about it. And by the way, this is something that you're going to see already on certain platforms, right? Like
that's a great flag to watch. I mean, where do you see it on other platforms? Can you actually yet?
Minecraft is incredibly anti-NFT. Actually, I think Minecraft just came out with a guidance basically saying that they think NFTs are incompatible with their platform.
Wow.
Right.
Okay.
And so that's a great example of, hey, like these guys are saying that it's not aligned with their incentives.
That is fascinating. Yeah, it's such a Web3 problem, right? Like you have to, quite literally on Web3, you have to make sure your incentives are aligned when you launch a project. Otherwise, you're not going to have any users and you might not have any clients either. So like it is like such a crucial component. I think that's a great framing of it, Sebastian. I really do like that. We're coming up here on the end of time, so I'm going to ask you one more broad question and let you shout out anything you want here at the end. But you know, as an active participant in Web3 ventures yourself, right, and as a builder, you know, exploring these ecosystems, what kind of advice do you have for folks who are trying to spin up their own projects, be it UGC or not, you know, just in general in the Web3 venture space? What would you tell them to keep in mind?
So the first thing I tell them is startups are hard. They're always hard. Like this is my third attempt at this rodeo, and I always forget just how annoying and hard it is every single time. I was like, oh, it'll be better next time. It never is. The thing that I always tell people is, one, make sure you're in good financial and personal health shape, like mental, financial, physical. Like that's incredibly important. Like if you're sick, if you don't have the resources to take a shot on goal, there are like, if you're good enough to be a founder and creating a new project, you're also good enough probably to work like an awesome job in tech or blockchain somewhere as well. That's not to discourage people from taking these shots, but I can't emphasize enough that I'm not a huge fan of sort of this like founder myth that we keep telling people where, oh, like we all took shots and we made lots of money. In reality, like I've been very fortunate I've had an exit before. And so that gives me the comfort of being able to afford rent irrespective of what the company does, which allows me to take more risk this time than I did last time. Right. And so I would say the most important thing about a project is like, hey, like be honest with yourself, make sure you understand your financial situation, make sure you understand your physical and mental health. If you are dealing with cancer, right, like if you're doing chemo, it's gonna be hard to run the company. Right. And so like, hey, go get your body in order, get that resolved. If you're having issues with your mental health, having been stuck in COVID for the last couple of years, go see a therapist, go get help, get that ready before you embark on this journey, because it's insanely stressful. And there are going to be a ton of up and downs. And for every story you hear about someone saying, oh, you know, I like talked to one person and raised a bunch of money and everything was hunky-dory, 99.999% of projects aren't that way. It's just a lot of iteration, a lot of failure, and just smiling and trying again.
I love that, Sebastian. That's a very real take, and it is super important. So I like to hear that personal force standpoint. Sebastian, this has been great having you on, man. Is there anything you want to shout out here at the end? Anything in particular you want the viewers to keep in mind here or look at? Yeah, I mean, I suppose I'll shout out Blockchain Korea. I'll be at Korea Blockchain Week on August 5th or 6th, 7th around then. I think it's going to be a really interesting event. I'm really curious to see how different ecosystems. I was born in the States. I'm Korean American, but I was born in the States. I haven't spent much time in Korea. So I'm really curious how they view blockchain and other things. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me a tweet or a DM. I'm at Sebastian Park on Twitter. And other than that, thanks for having me, Sam. All right. Well, no, Sebastian, you've been great. I hope that this was informational for everyone looking to learn a little bit about UGC and Web3. But keep in touch, guys. We'll be back with more. Thanks, Sebastian. See you around.